I would not at all be surprised if they are paid a sum of money for those children to go off with these older men. And think about, how are they paying their bills? How are they living in this house?
2 people confirmed receiving benefits, 20 people total connected to that address. I keep doing that math in my head over and over, and it never quite closes the gap cleanly. That's actually where I want to start today, because I think that gap, the space between what's confirmed and what obviously doesn't add up on paper, is the most honest place to begin a video like this. Viewers have been asking a version of the same question for weeks now. Where did the money go? I've seen it in comments more times than I can count, and I want to be upfront with you before we go any further, because I think it changes how you should listen to everything that follows. A lot of what I'm about to walk through is theory. It's a real question built out of facts we actually know, stitched together with inference about what those facts might mean. I'm not going to dress that up as something more certain than it is. If you've watched this channel before, you know that's not how we do this. So let's actually do it carefully, slowly. And let's start with the one thing that's actually confirmed, because everything else in this video sits on top of it. Vinton County Prosecutor William Archer told reporters directly that Christina Siders and Gary Siders Sr., the grandparents, the oldest 2 of the 4 adults charged in this case, were receiving state benefits at the time of their arrest on June 30th. He didn't specify which ones. Social Security, SNAP, some combination, something else entirely. He didn't say. But the confirmation itself is real, not a rumor. Not a theory somebody built from a Facebook post. Archer said it, on the record, to reporters covering this case. That's the anchor. I want you to actually hold on to how narrow that fact is, because I think it's really easy, once you start turning a case like this over in your head, to let one confirmed detail quietly expand into something much bigger than what's actually been documented. Here's the household this money was apparently supposed to support. 16 children were removed from that property on Omer Street on June 30th. 4 adults lived there too. Gary Sr., Christina, their son Gary Jr., and his wife Elizabeth. 20 people connected to one address. And as far as anyone's publicly confirmed, only 2 of those 20, the 2 oldest, were the ones actually receiving benefits. I think this is genuinely the tension driving most of the questions in the comments, and honestly, I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to wonder about. Benefit programs are generally built around a specific household size a person reports when they enroll. Fixed income for 2 elderly adults, Social Security, maybe a modest SNAP allotment, isn't designed to stretch across 20 people. So either the payments were somehow far larger than typical enrollment for 2 people would produce, or this household was surviving on dramatically less per person than anyone would consider adequate. Or there's some part of the financial picture here that just hasn't become public yet. I don't know which of those it is. I want to say that plainly, because nobody outside the agencies actually administering those benefits knows either. The specific dollar amounts, the specific programs, the specific household composition that was actually reported at enrollment, none of that's been made public. What we have is confirmation that benefits existed, sitting next to a household size that, just looking at it plainly, seems hard to reconcile with what 2 people's benefits would typically cover. This is where the theory a lot of you have raised comes in, that the household composition reported to whatever agency was involved might not have reflected who was actually living there. That the benefits themselves might have been obtained or maintained through some kind of misrepresentation, whether deliberate or just never updated. I want to walk through what that would actually require to be true, and just as importantly, what we genuinely don't know that would be necessary to confirm or rule it out. Government benefit programs, SNAP, TNF, Social Security dependent benefits, Medicaid, all require some form of ongoing reporting about who's in a household, what income's coming in, who's a dependent. That reporting isn't a one-time thing. Recipients are generally required to report changes, and agencies conduct periodic reviews, though how often and how rigorously varies enormously by state, by program, and honestly, by how overwhelmed the specific caseworker handling a given region happens to be at any given moment. If Christina and Gary Sr.'s enrollment reflected just the two of them, which is a pretty standard scenario for an elderly couple applying for benefits, but the actual household eventually grew to include their son, his wife, and 16 children. That's a real significant gap between what may have originally been reported and what was actually happening at that address, years later. Whether that gap ever got flagged, whether anyone from any agency ever actually recertified that household and noticed the difference, that's something none of us outside those specific case files actually knows. I think the honest answer here sits somewhere uncomfortable between two extremes. It's not they committed massive deliberate fraud. It's also not there's nothing here at all. The honest answer is that there's a real, documented gap in what's public. And that gap is exactly the kind of space where legitimate questions and pure speculation start to blur together if you're not careful about keeping them separate. I want to bring in something we've talked about before on this channel, because I think it connects directly to this financial thread in a way that's worth revisiting. The same county infrastructure responsible for administering benefits in Ohio is often structurally tied to the broader Department of Job and Family Services system that also handles child welfare oversight. When reporters asked Ohio Health directly whether hospital staff had ever raised concerns connected to this family across the birth events tied to Elizabeth Siders, the hospital cited federal privacy law and declined to answer. Athens County Children's Services cited confidentiality. And when Archer himself was asked directly about mandatory reporting connected to this family's medical history, his answer was simply, "I can't address that, sorry." I bring that up again here, not to just repeat an old point, but because I think it's actually part of the same pattern showing up in the financial thread too. Every institution with real documented contact with this family, hospitals, schools, apparently at least one benefits program, has consistently either declined to say what it knew or that information simply hasn't become public yet. That's not proof any of those institutions did something wrong, specifically, but it does mean the full financial picture of this household, how the benefits were actually structured, whether household size was ever formally updated, whether any red flag was ever raised internally and just never acted on, sits almost entirely outside public view right now. Let's talk about where the actual day-to-day money seems to have gone, based on what's been documented, because I think this is the piece a lot of your comments keep circling back to. There's a detail from reporting on this case that I find genuinely hard to sit with, precisely because of how ordinary it is. A woman working at a store near the family's previous residence in Cheshire told reporters that Gary Siders Jr. came in regularly, not for groceries, not for basic household supplies, for scratch-off lottery tickets. That was consistently what he bought, according to her account. She also said that on at least one occasion, he tipped her $10. I've mentioned that detail before, and I don't want to just repeat myself. What I haven't fully connected it to, until now, is this specific financial thread. If benefit income, however it was actually structured, was meant to help support a household this size, and some portion of that same household's available cash was instead going toward lottery tickets and cash tips at a convenience store, that's a genuinely uncomfortable thing to sit with. I want to be fair about it though. It doesn't prove fraud. People receiving public benefits aren't legally barred from spending their own discretionary money, the same way any other adult isn't. But it does raise a real question about resource allocation inside that specific household. Who was actually making spending decisions, how those decisions got made, and whether the person making them was the same person responsible for the conditions investigators eventually documented. I think that's actually the more precise version of the question a lot of you are asking. Once you strip away the more dramatic framing some corners of the internet have put on it. Not, was this a calculated scheme built entirely around exploiting government programs? Closer to, inside a household receiving public assistance, who decided how limited money actually got spent, And does that spending pattern tell us anything real about the priorities operating inside that home? I don't have a confirmed answer to that. I want to say that plainly because I think it's tempting. Once you lay a detail like the lottery tickets right next to a detail like unclear benefit structuring for a 20-person household, to draw a straight line between them that the actual evidence doesn't fully support yet. What we have is a handful of individually documented facts, benefits confirmed for 2 people, a household that eventually grew to 20, a pattern of discretionary spending by one adult on lottery tickets, that raise a genuinely legitimate question without, by themselves, answering it. There's something adjacent to this worth mentioning too, because it connects to the broader institutional thread this case keeps circling back to. Public benefit programs, particularly the kind tied to elderly recipients like Social Security, generally don't require the kind of active, ongoing verification that would automatically catch a household composition change, unless something specifically triggers a review. If Christina and Gary Sr.'s original enrollment was based on their status as an elderly couple, and nothing about their file ever got flagged for reevaluation across the years, this family lived at different addresses around Ohio. That's not necessarily evidence of anyone actively gaming a system. It's potentially just another version of the same institutional gap we keep running into everywhere else in this case. Systems built to track narrow, specific categories of information, with no real mechanism to cross-reference any of it against what's actually happening at a household level. That's a less dramatic explanation than deliberate fraud. But I think it's worth naming honestly, because I don't think a channel like this one does its job well if it only ever reaches for the version of events that generates the most outrage, instead of the version that's actually most consistent with everything else we've already documented about how far outside institutional reach this family seemed to exist for years. I want to be direct with you about where the actual investigation stands on this specific thread, because I think that's more useful than me speculating any further. There is no public confirmation from any prosecutor, investigator, or court filing that benefit fraud specifically is part of the criminal charges any of the 4 adults are currently facing. The charges that have been formally confirmed center on child endangerment. As of this recording, Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders have also now been indicted separately on charges connected to a sexual abuse investigation that originally led authorities to this family in the first place. Officials have said the victim in that specific case was not one of the couple's own children. Benefit fraud, as an investigative thread, if it even exists formally at all, has not been confirmed as part of anyone's charges at this point. That doesn't mean it isn't being looked at somewhere, quietly. Investigations at this scale often involve multiple agencies examining completely different threads of a family's history at the same time. And not everything an investigation touches becomes public before charges are actually filed, if they ever are. But I want to be honest with you about exactly where this stands right now. Where did the money go is a real question, raised by real, confirmed facts that genuinely don't fully add up on their own. It is not a confirmed finding. It is not a filed charge. It's not something any investigator, publicly, has gone on record connecting directly to fraud. I think that distinction actually matters enormously, and I want to explain why, because I think it might be the single most important thing in this entire video. When a case generates this much public attention, there's a real pull for channels covering it, and honestly, for the audience watching, to treat every unanswered question as evidence of a cover-up, and every gap in public information as proof that something worse is being hidden underneath it. Sometimes that instinct is right. We've documented, specifically in this case, real, genuine institutional silence that deserves scrutiny. Hospitals declining to confirm mandatory reporting. A prosecutor declining to directly address a question about medical oversight. Those are real, documented instances of institutions choosing not to answer. And I don't think that pattern should just be waved away. But a gap in public information isn't automatically evidence of the most dramatic possible explanation sitting behind it. Sometimes a gap is just that. A gap existing because an investigation is still active, because privacy law genuinely restricts what can be disclosed, or because the specific financial mechanics of how this household actually functioned simply haven't been the primary focus of what's made it into public reporting yet, given everything else this case has already generated. I think the honest, responsible thing to do here, sitting down to try to actually answer a question a lot of you have genuinely asked, is to tell you exactly what I've told you throughout this entire video. 2 adults, confirmed receiving benefits, a household that grew to 20 people, a documented pattern of one adult spending discretionary money on lottery tickets, and no public confirmation from any official source that fraud specifically is part of the criminal case currently being built against any of the 4 defendants. That's where this actually stands, not resolved, not confirmed as fraud, not dismissed as nothing either. Sitting in the same uncomfortable, unresolved space a lot of the individual threads in this case have occupied since June. Real questions, built on real, confirmed facts, without a clean answer attached to them yet. I want to add something here that's happened very recently, because I think it changes the shape of this case in a way that's worth understanding, even though it's a separate thread from the financial question we've spent most of this video on. Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders have now been formally indicted on additional serious charges, stemming from the same broader investigation that originally led authorities to discover this family and the 16 children living in that home. Officials have said the person involved in that specific case was not one of the couple's own children. I'm not going to go further into the specifics of that case here. It's a separate, serious legal matter, and I think it deserves its own careful, dedicated treatment rather than being folded quickly into a video about household finances. But I mention it because it's part of the honest, current picture of where this entire case actually stands. And I don't think it's responsible to talk about lottery tickets and benefit paperwork without acknowledging that the legal situation facing 2 of these 4 adults has grown significantly more serious in just the last few days. All 4 defendants, Gary Siders Sr., Christina Siders, Gary Siders Jr., and Elizabeth Siders, have pleaded not guilty to the charges formally filed against them, and all 4 remain, as a matter of law, presumed innocent until a court determines otherwise. That presumption applies regardless of how any of us feel about the unanswered financial questions we've spent this video walking through. The 16 children removed from that Omer Street property remain in care, receiving support through Ohio's child welfare system. That process continues, separate from and alongside whatever the criminal investigation into these 4 adults ultimately determines. The medical history, the truancy filings, the newly filed sexual abuse charges, and now this specific, still unresolved question about where the household's financial resources actually went. I don't have a clean ending for you today, because I don't think this particular thread has earned one yet. What I have is an honest accounting of what's actually confirmed, what's genuinely uncertain, and what remains, for now, exactly what a lot of you have been asking in the comments. A real question, built on real facts that don't fully add up. Not an answer I'm in any position to give you yet. If you want to keep following this case as more of these threads actually get resolved, the grand jury process, whatever additional charges may or may not eventually surface, and any further reporting on the financial side of this household that hasn't become public yet, stay subscribed. We'll keep telling you clearly what's actually confirmed, and we'll keep being honest with you about what's still just a theory, even when that's a less satisfying answer than the alternative everyone in the comments seems to want.